Captain Miles Vinter's boat sliced through the quiet waves of the ocean, the saltwater spray hitting his face as he focused on the horizon. The island ahead was small, uninhabited, and nothing more than a rocky outcrop, but it was the perfect place to escape from the noise of the world. Miles had been living a quiet life ever since he left the military years ago. The sea was his refuge, away from the chaos, away from everything. As he approached the island, he noticed something strange. There, floating just a few meters from the shore, was a small metallic object. It wasn't a ship, not like the boats Miles was used to, but something more like a pod. Curiosity got the better of him, and he steered his boat closer. Pulling his boat to the beach, he jumped out and waded through the shallow water. The pod was battered, its surface scratched and dented as if it had been through a storm. There was no sign of life, no movement. It was quiet, but something about it felt wrong. Miles hesitated for a moment, then decided to investigate. He reached the pod and slowly climbed up, carefully avoiding the sharp edges. As he reached for the hatch, it suddenly opened with a soft hiss. Inside, he saw two figures, an alien woman and a small child. They were unconscious, barely breathing, and covered in dirt. Miles quickly realized that they were in trouble. He knelt beside the woman first. Her skin was a shade of green that was unlike anything he'd ever seen, smooth and almost shimmering in the dim light. She wore strange clothes, unlike any fabric from Earth, and her body was thin, almost skeletal. She looked fragile, but there was a strange strength in her features, something powerful even in her weakened state. Her long black hair was tangled, and her eyes, when they opened, were filled with pain and confusion. The little girl next to her was even more frail. She had the same green skin, but her eyes were large, innocent, and full of fear. Her hair was a soft shade of silver, and her tiny hands clutched onto her mother's arm as if holding on for dear life. The woman's faint breathing indicated that she was alive, but just barely. Miles acted quickly. He checked their pulses. Both were weak but still there. He had seen enough injuries and survival situations in his time as a soldier to recognize that they needed help immediately. His first thought was to get them back to his boat and figure out what to do next. But as he looked at them, he felt something else stir in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. The urge to protect. After a quick check to see if there was anything dangerous in the pod, Miles gently lifted the woman in his arms, careful not to hurt her fragile frame. With his free hand, he reached for the little girl, who was still staring up at him with wide, scared eyes. "Hey," Miles said softly, "I'm not going to hurt you. We need to get out of here, okay?" The girl didn't respond, but she seemed to understand. She didn't cry or try to pull away. Instead, she followed his lead as he carried both of them back toward his boat. Once aboard, Miles laid the woman down on the deck and turned to the girl. She was staring at him, her small body trembling, but she didn't run. Miles had seen fear like this before, and he knew that it was often better not to force someone to speak when they were this scared. He gave her a reassuring smile. "My name is Miles," he said gently. "What's your name?" The girl didn't answer at first, but after a moment, she mumbled something in a language Miles didn't understand. It was a strange, melodic sound, and even though he couldn't make out the words, he could tell it wasn't human. Miles nodded, unsure of what to say next. "Okay, no problem. We'll figure it out." He checked on the woman again. Her breathing was still shallow, and her body was cold. He needed to get them to a safe place, but the nearest hospital was miles away, and their survival depended on how quickly he could get help. The island wasn't far, and Miles knew it better than most. He had visited it many times for the solitude it offered. It would be a safe place to keep them hidden until he could figure out what to do next. The woman's eyes fluttered open as he started the engine, her gaze meeting his with an intensity that made Miles pause. She didn't speak, but there was a recognition in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement that she knew he had saved them, at least for now. Her lips moved as if she wanted to say something, but no sound came out. Her face twisted in pain, and she closed her eyes again, retreating into unconsciousness. "Hang on," Miles muttered, gripping the wheel tighter as the boat sped toward the island. He had no idea who they were or where they came from, but one thing was certain: they were in danger. And as much as he wanted to go back to his quiet life, he couldn't turn his back on them now. The island grew larger as they approached, its jagged cliffs rising above the calm sea. Miles pulled the boat up onto the shore and quickly moved the woman and child to a sheltered area, away from view. The next few days would be crucial. He had to figure out what happened to them, what they needed, and most importantly, how to keep them safe. Miles didn't know why he was doing this. It wasn't like him to get involved in anyone else's problems, but something about the sight of that little girl and her mother in such a desperate state called to him. It was as if they weren't just strangers. They were a responsibility now. And that, for better or worse, meant Miles had a new purpose. The days following their arrival on Wraith Island were quiet but filled with tension. Miles had no idea what kind of trouble the woman and her daughter were running from, but he knew one thing. The last thing they needed was to be found. The small island, with its jagged cliffs and dense forests, had always been a safe haven for him. It wasn't much, but it was isolated, perfect for keeping the rest of the world away. Miles made a shelter out of some old tarps and wooden branches he found on the island, creating a safe place where they could rest. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The woman, Xena, still looked weak, her eyes always closed, as if she was saving what little energy she had left. Kaya, her young daughter, spent most of her time staring at Miles with wide, curious eyes. She didn't speak, but she watched him closely, like she was trying to figure out who he was. Miles didn't mind the silence. He wasn't used to having company, let alone an alien and her child. But there was something about them that made him feel protective. It was strange. He had always been a loner, a man who kept his distance from others, yet something about this little family made him feel like he had a duty. Over the next few days, Miles did his best to make them comfortable. He brought fresh water from the nearby stream, hunted fish, and gathered what little food the island offered. He even set up a small fire pit to keep them warm at night. Xena hadn't said much to him since their arrival, her broken English too difficult to understand. But Kaya, the little girl, was different. She was quiet, but her eyes were full of questions. She didn't ask for anything, but her gaze followed Miles wherever he went. And sometimes she would offer him a small smile when he brought food or water. One afternoon, as Miles was gathering more firewood, he found Kaya sitting by the shore, staring out at the ocean. Her small frame was hunched, her arms wrapped around her knees. The wind blew through her silver hair, and for a moment, Miles almost didn't recognize her. She looked so small, so fragile against the vastness of the sea. "Hey, you okay?" Miles asked, walking up to her carefully. Kaya turned to him, her large, dark eyes meeting his with a mix of curiosity and sadness. She didn't speak, but she nodded slightly. Miles sat down next to her, keeping a respectful distance. "You miss home, huh?" he asked, not sure if she understood him. He couldn't imagine what she had gone through, being so young and already on the run from something dangerous. Kaya didn't answer, but her gaze shifted to the sky. Miles followed her eyes and saw the setting sun turning the sky into a beautiful mix of oranges and pinks. It was peaceful here, so different from the world they had come from. But he knew that peace wouldn't last long. He could feel the weight of something dark hanging in the air, something that threatened to disrupt everything. "Do you know where you're from?" Miles asked gently, though he didn't expect an answer. Kaya glanced up at him, her face filled with confusion. She spoke a few words in her alien language, the sound soft but flowing. Miles didn't understand a word, but he could tell it was something important. He wasn't sure how to communicate with her, but he smiled, trying to offer comfort. "I don't know what you're saying, but we'll figure it out," he said softly. "I'll help you." Both of you. Kaya seemed to understand that, and for the first time since they arrived on the island, she smiled at him. It wasn't a big smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. Miles felt a small sense of relief. Maybe they were beginning to trust him. That evening after dinner, Xena finally stirred. She hadn't moved much since their arrival, but now her eyes fluttered open, and she looked around the small camp. Her gaze landed on Miles, and for the first time, she spoke. Her voice was weak, but it was clear. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaky. "You saved us." Miles had no idea how to respond. It wasn't often that someone thanked him for anything, but there was something about her words that made him feel like this wasn't just about survival. There was a deeper connection here, something that went beyond simple kindness. "You don't need to thank me," Miles replied, his voice gruff. "It's not safe here, but I'll keep you both hidden as long as I can." Xena nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also with something else, something that looked like pain. She wasn't just thankful for being saved. She was worried. Miles could see it in the way her hands trembled, the way she glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting something to appear from the shadows. "I need to rest," she whispered, closing her eyes again. Miles watched her for a moment before standing up. There was still so much he didn't understand. He had no idea where they were from, or why they were being chased, or what kind of danger was out there. But he couldn't let that stop him. He couldn't leave them. As he sat down by the fire later that night, watching the flames dance and crackle, Miles made a silent promise to himself. He didn't know how long they would be safe here, or if they would ever be able to go back to their own world. But one thing was clear. He was their guardian now. Whether he liked it or not, he was the one who would protect them from whatever came next. The stars above twinkled brightly, their light faint against the darkness of the night. Miles knew that this was just the beginning. The island, for now, was a sanctuary, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something far worse than they had yet encountered. The days on the island passed slowly, with the sound of waves crashing against the shore being the only constant in their quiet life. Miles continued his routine, gathering food, setting traps, and making sure Xena and Kaya were safe. But even as the island provided them with temporary peace, he could feel the weight of something dangerous hanging in the air. Xena had stayed mostly silent since they arrived. She spent most of her time resting, her eyes closed, her mind seemingly far away. Kaya, on the other hand, was becoming more comfortable with Miles. She was still quiet, but her gaze wasn't filled with as much fear anymore. Sometimes she would join Miles as he worked around the camp, helping him with small tasks, like gathering wood or filling water from the stream. Despite her young age, she was resourceful, and Miles couldn't help but be impressed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the fire crackled in the center of their camp, Xena finally spoke again. Her voice was soft, but filled with an urgency that caught Miles' attention. "Where are we?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. Miles paused, surprised by the question. He hadn't expected her to speak up, especially after so many days of silence. It was clear she had been avoiding talking, maybe because she didn't know how much she could trust him. But now, there was something different in her eyes, a desperation to connect. "We're on Wraith Island," Miles replied. "It's a small place. No one comes here, which is why I thought it would be a good place to hide." Xena's eyes darkened, and her hands clenched into fists. "No one, yet," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Her voice trembled as if she was afraid to say more. Miles noticed the shift in her demeanor, the way her body tensed, as if she was reliving something painful. He didn't know much about Xena. She hadn't shared much with him, but it was clear that whatever she was running from, it wasn't something she wanted to talk about. Kaya, sitting by the fire, glanced between them with a worried look on her face. Her small hands pulled at the edges of her clothing, as if she could sense the tension between them. "Xena, I don't mean to push," Miles said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "But if you're hiding something, you should tell me." I'm here to help you. But I need to understand what's going on. If there's a threat, I need to know." Xena's gaze softened, and for the first time since they arrived, she seemed to consider his words. She closed her eyes for a long moment, breathing deeply, before finally opening them again. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as if sharing this truth made her vulnerable. I was part of a peaceful people. My world, my people. We were scientists, explorers. We wanted to learn, not conquer. But then, they came." She paused, her eyes far away as if the memory was too painful to relive. A group of violent beings. They wanted our knowledge, our technology. They wanted to use it to take control of the stars, of everything. My husband was one of the leaders. He tried to stop them. But they killed him. Miles could see the pain in her eyes, the deep sadness that came from losing someone so important. He didn't speak, just letting her continue, knowing that she needed to say this. Xena took another breath, steadying herself. "After they killed him, they came for me. For Kaya. They wanted her because she's different. She has abilities, things they can't understand, and they think they can use her to control our technology." Miles could see the worry in her eyes as she glanced down at Kaya, who was now sitting silently, her face unreadable. The little girl had been so quiet lately. It was as if she understood far more than a child her age should. "They destroyed our ship. We barely escaped," Xena continued, her voice shaking. I thought we would be safe, but they will come for us. They won't stop. They want Kaya, and they won't rest until they have her." Miles could see the fear in her eyes, a fear that made his heart ache. He had no idea what kind of beings Xena was talking about, but he didn't need to know the details to understand that they were dangerous. He'd seen enough in his life to know when someone was truly terrified. "We're not safe here," Xena whispered, looking down at her hands, her voice full of regret. "I shouldn't have brought her here. I should have kept running." Miles frowned, shaking his head. "No, you did the right thing. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, to her. We'll figure this out." Xena's gaze lifted, and for the first time, there was a hint of hope in her eyes. "You really would protect us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Miles nodded firmly, though a part of him wasn't sure if he was making a promise he could keep. "You've got nothing to fear while I'm here. I'll make sure no one gets to you." Xena didn't say anything, but her tired eyes softened. She looked at Kaya, who had now curled up by the fire, her small form wrapped in a blanket. Then Xena turned back to Miles, a quiet understanding passing between them. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't know what that means." As the fire crackled between them, Miles felt a renewed sense of purpose. The island, for all its isolation, was not safe enough to keep the danger away forever. He had no idea what kind of enemies Xena and Kaya were running from, but one thing was clear: he couldn't let them face it alone. The next few days on Wraith Island were a blur of preparation. Miles kept the camp secure, fortifying the shelter and setting up more traps around the area. The forest around them was dense, full of tall trees and thick underbrush, but Miles knew that if anyone was coming, they would leave signs. He kept a careful watch, scanning the horizon and listening to the faintest of sounds. The last thing he wanted was for Xena and Kaya to be caught off guard. Xena, though still weak, had started to become more alert. She no longer spent her days lost in her thoughts. She would help when she could, gathering food or making small repairs to the shelter. Kaya, ever quiet, had grown attached to Miles in her own way. She watched him constantly, but the fear in her eyes had lessened. Her trust in him was growing. But there were moments when Miles couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavy, as if the island itself was holding its breath. He couldn't explain it, but he could sense that something was approaching, something that wasn't natural. One afternoon, as he was checking the traps he had set in the woods, Miles noticed something strange. The leaves on the trees seemed to tremble, as if stirred by an invisible force. The wind had died down, and the air felt unnaturally still. It was then that he heard the faintest sound, a low hum, like the buzz of a distant engine. His heart began to race. Miles dropped the branch he had been inspecting and hurried back to the camp. As he approached, he saw Kaya standing by the fire, her small form rigid, her gaze fixed on the sky. Xena was sitting near the shelter, her face pale as she stared in the same direction. Something was wrong. "Xena," Miles called as he ran toward her. "What's going on?" Xena didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the sky, her eyes narrowed with a mixture of fear and recognition. It was as if she had seen something in the clouds that only she could understand. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "It's them." Miles turned to Kaya, who was now trembling. Her small hands were pressed to her chest, and her eyes were wide with terror. She didn't need to say anything. Miles could feel the same fear in the air. The sound of the humming grew louder, closer. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was the unmistakable noise of something mechanical. A ship. The hairs on the back of Miles' neck stood up as he realized what was happening. "They found us," Xena said, her voice barely a whisper. "It won't be long now." Miles didn't waste any time. "We need to move. Now." He grabbed Kaya's hand, and Xena quickly stood, her body still weak but determined. They had no time to pack everything up. There was no escape by sea, no way to outrun them. Miles knew that the only option was to hide. They ran deeper into the forest, moving quickly and silently. Miles led the way, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of danger. Xena, despite her weakened state, kept up, her eyes constantly scanning the sky. Kaya's small form was right behind them, clutching onto her mother's hand for safety. The forest grew darker as they moved deeper, the dense trees casting long shadows over the path. Miles knew the island well, and he led them toward a small cave that he had found years ago. It was hidden behind a thick wall of vines, almost impossible to spot unless you knew exactly where to look. It was the perfect place to take cover. But as they reached the cave, a shadow passed overhead. Miles looked up just in time to see a large ship, dark and menacing, hovering in the sky above them. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, sleek, metallic, and silent, as if it was a part of the darkness itself. The humming sound that had been growing louder was now deafening. The ship's shape was not human, but something far more advanced, far more dangerous. "They're here," Xena whispered, her voice trembling. Miles didn't hesitate. "Get inside the cave. Now." He shoved Xena and Kaya into the darkness, pushing them toward the small entrance. As soon as they were in, he turned to face the ship. He knew he couldn't fight it. Not with his small boat, not with the resources they had. The best chance they had was to stay hidden. From the darkness of the cave, Miles could see the ship's massive shadow passing overhead. The ground vibrated with the force of its engines. The ship hovered above the island for what seemed like hours, its searchlights cutting through the trees, illuminating every corner of the forest. Miles held his breath, praying that they wouldn't be found. But the ship didn't land. It didn't seem to be searching for anything in particular. Instead, it circled the island, as if waiting for something, waiting for someone. After what felt like an eternity, the ship finally began to move away, its engine noise fading into the distance. The forest grew quiet again, and the trembling stopped. Miles let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "They're gone," he whispered, though doubt still lingered in his mind. Xena came to the entrance of the cave, her eyes wide with fear. "That was them. They were looking for us." Miles nodded, his mind racing. But why didn't they land? Why didn't they search the island? "I don't know," Xena said, her voice shaking. "Maybe they're waiting for something. Maybe they think we're still out there." Kaya, who had been silent until now, spoke up softly. "They're coming back." Miles turned to the little girl, his heart heavy. "What do you mean?" Kaya's eyes were wide, filled with an unsettling certainty. They're coming back for us. They won't stop until they get us. The word sent a chill down Miles' spine. He had no idea what he was up against, but one thing was certain: this was only the beginning. The island was no longer a safe place, and as the shadows of the night grew longer, Miles knew that he had to act fast if he was going to protect Xena and Kaya from the forces hunting them. The cave felt colder now, even though the air outside had warmed with the setting sun. Miles sat against the rough stone wall, his eyes fixed on the entrance. Xena was close by, her head resting against the wall as she tried to regain her strength. Kaya sat silently beside her mother, her small hands wringing a cloth she had found, her face pale with worry. They all knew the danger wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. Miles hadn't been wrong to feel the weight of something dark in the air. The ship that had hovered above them wasn't just an ordinary search party. There was something more behind it, something that made his blood run cold. Xena's words echoed in his mind. They were looking for us. He knew it wasn't just Kaya they were after. They wanted both of them, and that meant Miles was now a target too. The island, once a place of peace for Miles, had become a trap. There was no way they could hide forever. The ship would be back. It had only been scouting the area. Miles had no doubt that it would return with reinforcements, and when it did, the island's remote location would no longer protect them. "We need to move," Miles said, his voice steady but urgent. "We can't stay here." Xena looked up at him, her face a mix of fear and determination. "Where can we go? They've already found us once. They'll find us again." Miles rubbed the back of his neck, thinking. He had lived on this island for years, but he knew it wasn't big enough to keep hiding forever. There was a place, a deep cave hidden on the far side of the island, that he had never shown anyone. It was far from where they were now, hidden among a dense thicket of trees and thick brush. If they were going to escape the search, it was their best shot. "It's risky, but it's our only chance," Miles said. "I know a place on the other side of the island. We can hide there for a while, until we figure out what to do next." Xena's eyes were filled with doubt. She didn't like the idea of moving again, of risking everything on a place she had never seen. But she nodded slowly, her exhaustion clear. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice small. Miles stood up, scanning the entrance of the cave once more. He could feel the tension in the air. There was no time to waste. The ship would be back soon, and if they were still here when it did, there would be no escape. "Kaya, stay close to your mother," Miles said, his tone firm but gentle. "Don't go too far from me." Kaya nodded, her wide eyes filled with fear. She didn't speak, but her grip on her mother's hand tightened. The three of them began to move cautiously through the forest. Miles led the way, his senses on high alert. He knew the island well, but the fear of being hunted made every sound, every rustle in the bushes, seem louder than it actually was. He kept his pace steady, trying not to draw attention to their movements. As they made their way through the dense woods, Miles couldn't help but notice how silent the forest was. There were no birds chirping, no insects buzzing. It was as if the island itself had become aware of the danger and was holding its breath. The only sound was the soft crunch of leaves under their feet and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. "We're close," Miles murmured as they approached a thick wall of vines. He pushed them aside, revealing a narrow opening that led deeper into the forest. "The cave is just beyond this thicket." Xena and Kaya followed him, moving quickly but cautiously. The heavy silence seemed to press down on them, making each step feel like a risk. Miles could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he moved ahead, eyes darting from side to side, scanning for any sign of movement. As they neared the cave, a sudden noise startled them. A low rumble echoed through the trees, and the ground seemed to shake for a moment. Miles froze, his heart leaping into his throat. He knew that sound. The ship was back. Without thinking, Miles grabbed Xena's arm and pulled her into the cave. Kaya stumbled behind them, her wide eyes filled with panic. "Get inside," Miles hissed, urgency in his voice. They ducked into the dark cave just as the ship appeared overhead, its shadow passing over them like a dark cloud. The hum of its engines was deafening as it hovered just above the trees. Miles held his breath, hoping they hadn't been spotted. Inside the cave, the air was cool and damp. Miles pressed himself against the wall, his eyes glued to the entrance, watching for any signs of the ship moving away. He could hear the distant sounds of the ship's engines, the faint hum growing fainter as it flew further away. But Miles didn't move. He waited, listening carefully. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Finally, the sound of the ship's engines faded completely, leaving only the eerie silence of the island behind. "Are they gone?" Xena whispered, her voice trembling. Miles slowly exhaled. For now. They stayed in the cave for a while longer, not daring to make a sound. Miles kept an eye on the entrance, his hand on the hilt of the knife he always carried. If the ship returned, they would need to be ready to move again. After what felt like an eternity, Miles spoke again, his voice calm but firm. "We need to keep moving. They're not going to give up. We'll need to stay one step ahead of them." Xena nodded, but her face was pale with exhaustion. She looked at Kaya, who was quietly clutching her side, her face filled with fear and uncertainty. The child hadn't said a word, but Miles could see the toll it was taking on her. "We'll be okay," Miles said, his voice reassuring but with an edge of uncertainty. He wasn't sure if he believed it himself, but he had to give them hope. "We just have to stay hidden, stay smart, and we can't stop moving." Xena's eyes met his, her face softening with gratitude. She knew he was doing everything he could, but the fear in her eyes remained. The danger was real. The hunt had only just begun. The days following their escape into the cave were tense and filled with quiet urgency. The sound of the ship's engines never fully left their minds. Every moment, every sound, made them jump. Miles kept them moving, finding new hiding places and always staying alert. The island had become a maze of danger. They had made their way to the far side of the island, as far from the shore as possible, where the trees grew thicker and the underbrush was more difficult to navigate. But even here, Miles knew, they weren't safe. The ship could return at any time, and if it did, they would need a better plan. Xena, despite her exhaustion, had been surprisingly helpful. She knew how to navigate the forest and had shown Miles how to use the island's resources to their advantage. Together, they had crafted a system of signals, simple gestures to let each other know when to move or hide. Kaya, however, had grown quieter. The fear in her eyes never seemed to fade. She would often stare off into the distance, lost in her thoughts. Miles didn't know what she was seeing, but he could tell it troubled her deeply. She had always been the strong one, keeping her emotions hidden behind a mask of silence. But now, even she seemed to feel the weight of the hunt. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the shadows lengthened, Miles set up a small camp near the base of a cliff. They had moved deeper into the forest, far from their last hiding spot, and for the first time in days, there was a sense of calm. The ship had not returned, and there was no sign of danger on the horizon. "I think we're safe for now," Miles said, his voice low as he looked at Xena, who was tending to the small fire they had built. She nodded, but her expression was weary. "Safe doesn't mean we're safe forever," she replied, her eyes dark with concern. "They will keep coming. They won't stop." Miles nodded in agreement. He knew the reality. They couldn't hide forever. The ship would eventually return, and when it did, they needed to be ready. But for tonight, they allowed themselves a moment of rest. The last few days had been brutal. Moving constantly, staying hidden, it was wearing on all of them. As the night fell, Kaya quietly walked to the edge of their camp, staring out at the thick forest beyond. Miles watched her for a moment, sensing something was wrong. "Kaya," he called softly, his voice full of concern. Kaya didn't respond at first. She simply stood there, her small body rigid, her gaze fixed on the shadows beyond their camp. After a moment, she turned to face him, her expression distant, as if lost in thought. "I know they're coming back," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "They're closer now. I can feel them." Miles frowned. He had suspected something was off, but hearing Kaya say it aloud made his heart race. He didn't know how she could know this, but he trusted her instincts. She was never wrong about these things. "We need to move," Miles said, his voice firm, his mind already shifting into survival mode. "We can't wait for them to find us." Xena stood up immediately, her exhaustion forgotten. "How long do we have?" "I don't know," Miles admitted, his eyes scanning the trees, trying to make sense of the forest. He felt the weight of the hunt closing in around them. "But we need to move fast." The camp was quickly packed up, and they began to move once more through the forest. This time, Miles led them toward a narrow valley that ran between two high cliffs. It was a place he had discovered on his own, a natural passageway that was hard to find unless you knew the island well. It was tight, hidden, and the perfect place to keep out of sight. As they moved, the trees around them began to feel darker, the shadows stretching longer as the sun set completely. The air was thick with tension, and even the usual sounds of the island seemed to have vanished. It was as if the island itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a faint, distant hum. At first, it was almost impossible to hear over the rustling of the leaves, but then it grew louder. The sound of an engine, low, steady, and unmistakable. "The ship," Miles muttered, his heart pounding. It was closer than he had expected. They had no time to waste. "Move, now." They pushed through the thick brush, rushing toward the valley. Miles was at the front, leading the way as fast as he could without making too much noise. Xena followed closely behind, her breathing ragged, but determined. Kaya was right behind her small feet barely making a sound on the ground. The hum grew louder, closer. Miles glanced over his shoulder, seeing the faint glow of searchlights cutting through the trees. The ship was coming, and it was coming fast. "We need to get to the valley," Miles said through gritted teeth. "Keep moving." They reached the narrow entrance to the valley, just as the searchlights swept over them. Miles pulled them all into the darkness between the cliffs. The narrow passage offered some protection, but it wasn't foolproof. The ship could still spot them if it looked closely enough. They pressed themselves against the walls of the valley, holding their breath as the ship flew overhead, its engines roaring. The searchlights swept back and forth, but for now, they were hidden. Miles's heart was in his throat as he listened to the ship pass by, its massive shadow looming overhead. It felt like the world had stopped moving, as if time itself was frozen. Finally, the sound of the engines began to fade. The ship had passed. They were safe, for now. But Miles knew that it wouldn't be long before they returned, and when they did, they would be ready. The days that followed were a blur of fear and constant movement. Miles knew that the ship wasn't far behind them. The humming of its engines always lingered in the back of his mind, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. They had barely escaped once, but he knew they wouldn't be so lucky a second time. Every moment, they were getting closer to being found. The hunt had intensified, and there was no safe place left on the island. The trio had moved farther into the heart of the island, hoping to find some sort of refuge. The trees were thicker here, the shadows darker, but Miles knew that nature wasn't going to protect them. There were no more caves, no more hiding spots. They were running out of time. "We can't keep running forever," Miles said one evening as they sat around a small fire. The glow of the flames cast long shadows across his face. Xena, sitting next to him, didn't say anything. Her face was pale, and her eyes were filled with the same fear that had taken over Kaya's. The little girl sat close to her mother, her head resting on Xena's shoulder. Xena finally broke the silence. "Then what do we do, Miles? We've been hiding for days." There's nowhere left to go. Miles rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of their situation pressing down on him. He had no good answers, but he knew one thing. If they didn't do something now, the ship would come for them, and they wouldn't stand a chance. "We need to take the fight to them," Miles said, his voice steady. He could feel the tension in the air, the uneasy silence that followed his words. "We need to destroy their ship. If we do that, they'll have no way to track us down." Xena blinked, clearly shocked by the idea. "Destroy their ship? Are you crazy? How are we supposed to do that?" Miles stood up, his mind racing with plans and ideas. "I've been watching them. I know the ship's weak spots. If we can get close enough, we might be able to disable their engines. It's risky, but it's the only chance we have." Xena shook her head, her voice filled with doubt. "It's not just the ship we need to worry about. They've been hunting us for days. What if they have more soldiers on the ground?" "They probably do," Miles agreed. "But if we can destroy the ship, they won't be able to send more forces. We'll have a chance to escape before they can regroup." Kaya, who had been quiet up until now, spoke up. Her voice was soft, but there was a seriousness in it that made Miles pause. "What if we don't survive?" Miles looked at the little girl, his heart aching. He knelt down in front of her. "We will survive. I promise. We'll get through this together." Kaya didn't say anything more, but the way she looked at him made him feel like she understood what needed to be done. She trusted him. They spent the next few hours preparing. Miles gathered what little gear they had left, sharpening a few makeshift weapons, and checking the traps they'd set up earlier. Xena, although frightened, worked beside him, her determination returning. Kaya helped where she could, gathering sticks for the fire, though her hands were shaking. The island felt different now. The air was thick with tension. Miles could sense that the ship was closer, even if he couldn't see it. Every movement, every step, felt like a countdown to something they couldn't stop. When night fell, they set out under the cover of darkness. Miles led them through the trees, moving swiftly but quietly. They were headed toward the shore, where the ship had last been spotted. He knew that the only chance they had of destroying it was to strike when it was vulnerable. The journey was long, and they moved through the dense jungle without a sound. The trees above them blocked out most of the moonlight, leaving them in near total darkness. Miles kept them moving, his instincts guiding him as they neared the shore. At last, they reached the rocky cliffs that overlooked the water. Below them, on a flat stretch of beach, the ship was anchored. It was a massive, dark shape against the backdrop of the night, its engines silent for now. Miles felt a chill run down his spine as he realized how close they were to the ship. "We need to get closer," he whispered to Xena, who nodded grimly. They made their way down the cliffside, carefully navigating the rocky terrain. Every step felt like it could be their last. The sound of the ocean below was the only noise they could hear, but Miles knew that the ship would be scanning the area soon. They had to move quickly. They reached the bottom of the cliff, and Miles motioned for them to stop. He could see the ship now, its dark shape looming in the distance. It was larger up close, its sleek design almost alien in the moonlight. But there was something else, something even more dangerous. The ship wasn't alone. A group of armed figures stood near the ship, their silhouettes illuminated by the faint light of their own searchlights. They were waiting. And if Miles and his group were going to make it out alive, they had to act now. "This is it," Miles whispered, his voice tense with urgency. "We move when I say. Follow me." He waited for a moment, scanning the area. The soldiers were focused on the ship, their attention not yet on the cliffs above them. Miles didn't know how long they would have before they were spotted, but he couldn't waste any more time. "Go," he ordered. They ran, as quietly as possible, toward the ship. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the ocean breeze. Miles led the way, keeping close to the shadows. They were almost there, just a few more steps. Then, as they neared the ship, one of the soldiers turned, his eyes catching the movement. A shout rang out in the darkness. Miles' heart raced. The chase had begun.